You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 35, The Hanging of Roy Carter. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Ashley Thomas, sitting in for Norman Lau. Each week on Gene-ology, we hang out and talk about Gene Roddenberry's early TV work, looking for the kind of morals, meanings, and messages that became a famous fixture of his later creation, Star Trek.
This week, we kick off our coverage of Gene's writing for the second season of Have Gun, Will Travel with the episode The Hanging of Roy Carter. I'll do my best to keep the gallows humor to a minimum.
Earl will be back with trivia in a moment, but first, here's how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also just the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X, formerly known as Twitter, and Facebook at missionlogpod. While you're at it, please leave us a review and rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please remember, your comments could be used on a future installment of Gene-ology. And now, this week's trivia.
Thank you, Ashley. Having written 5 scripts for the first season of Have Gun, Will Travel, the only thing Gene could do for an encore was to contribute 6 scripts to Season 2. The Hanging of Roy Carter is the first of those, premiering on October 4th, 1958, just 4 episodes into Have Gun's new season. In a minor coincidence, this episode was followed a week later with an episode written by Bruce Geller, who would later become famous for creating Mission Impossible, and that means that he became a fellow showrunner on the Desilu Studios lot at the same time Gene was launching Star Trek in 1966. And yes, we do have something here that, in hindsight, reads like a gigantic Star Trek Easter egg in the character of Chaplain Robert April, a name that would turn up again in Gene's March 1964 pitch document, Star Trek Is, as the captain of the starship Yorktown. The names of both the ship and her captain changed by the time Star Trek filmed its first pilot, but the character of April, and his status as the first captain of the Enterprise, have since been cemented on screen in the animated series, in Star Trek Strange New Worlds, and in official tie-in media. Examining the use of this name outside of its well-known Star Trek trappings makes it seem likely that there was a real Robert April to whom Gene was giving a shout-out, perhaps an old war buddy, which is something Gene has been known to do in his work. Are there other Star Trek connections? Oh yes. We would be seeing members of this episode's cast in the 23rd and 24th centuries. Keno Smith is played by actor Barry Russo, who would guest star in 2 episodes of the original series as Giotto in Devil in the Dark, another rumination on mercy and justice, and he would return in The Ultimate Computer as Commodore Robert Wesley. Now, hey, haven't we heard that name somewhere before? It's Gene's old pen name from when he was only a part-time TV writer, but still a full-time cop. Small universe. Roy Carter himself is played by actor Scott Marlowe in his first of 3 appearances on Have Gun, Will Travel. But, get this, Scott's next appearance in Have Gun will also see him playing a part in one of Gene's scripts, in the 3rd season episode Charlie Red Dog. Put a pin in that, we'll get there fairly soon. Scott would also play a part in Star Trek lore much later, guest starring as the grizzled Bajoran Keeve Falor in the Next Generation episode Ensign Rowe in 1991. And although Have Gun, Will Travel hit the airwaves over a decade prior to Monty Python's instructional piece about how to recognize different trees from quite a long way away, it should be noted that Robert April was played by John Larch, while Warden John Bullock was played by Paul Birch. Despite this, and fortunately for everyone who's ever seen this episode, neither of these storied actors could be accused of putting in a wooden performance. Act 1. It's the dead of night, and Paladin sleeps by his campfire as his horse stands nearby. But he's not alone. A man quietly pulls the gun out of Paladin's holster and takes his derringer as well. He points his own gun at Paladin's head with his finger on the trigger, but then he relents and turns to steal the horse instead. But Paladin is a light sleeper, and he pounces unarmed on the other man. The would-be horse thief fires a wild shot in the struggle, but hits nothing. Paladin has both of his weapons back in his hands when an entire posse shows up. But they're not there for Paladin. They surround his attacker and put a noose around his neck. Paladin mentions that he likes lynchings even less than he likes horse thieves, and he doesn't see a badge on any of the men who have shown up, particularly not Sidney Carter, the man who seems to be in charge. These men are not law enforcement, they're vigilantes, and they've been hunting for Keno Smith, the man who tried to steal Paladin's horse. Paladin demands to know what's going on, and it goes something like this. Smith robbed the Carson City coach of hundreds of thousands of dollars and murdered its driver, but Carter's son Roy was framed for the crime and now awaits execution in a jail cell. Paladin is incredulous. Shouldn't Carter be directing his effort towards saving his son, as opposed to hanging a man in the middle of the desert? And it turns out that some members of Carter's would-be lynch mob have had that same question, but they've been afraid to ask. A telegram to the governor could halt the execution of Roy Carter, but only if everyone stops trying to lynch Smith and makes for their nearest U.S. Marshal's office to wire the governor. Keno Smith confesses, and Carter, his right-hand man Jesse, and Paladin all offer sworn depositions. That should be enough to halt the execution. Except the governor's on tour and can't be reached. He's a day's horseback ride away. That will be too late. The elder Carter tells Jesse to start organizing a jailbreak, right in front of the marshal, who cautions against any such rash action. The marshal will talk to the warden, a man named Bullock, and explain the situation and ask for a delay. But Carter points out that Bullock is hell-bent on hanging Roy. The murdered stagecoach driver was Bullock's son. Paladin suggests that one man inside the jail could do much more good than an entire posse besieging it from outside. He asks the marshal to appoint him a federal witness. Then Paladin hands his business card to Carter and says that saving an innocent man's life is a service performed pro bono, but for the trouble he's about to have to go through to save Roy Carter's life, he's charging the elder Carter $5,000. Act 2. At the state penitentiary, Paladin presents the guards with proof that he is a federal witness to the execution and surrenders his weapons to them. Then Paladin demands that the guards awaken both the warden and the prison chaplain. The warden, John Bullock, is an old war horse who intends to execute the prisoner at the appointed hour, regardless of what evidence Paladin presents. Paladin is only asking for a 3-hour delay, long enough for word to reach the governor and for a stay of execution to be transmitted to Bullock. But Bullock isn't budging. The prison chaplain, a meek man named Robert April, points out that it's only a short delay, but it quickly becomes apparent that he and Bullock have had this argument before, and that April has seldom, if ever, won. Bullock points out that April's own Bible makes the argument of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Paladin is unimpressed with Bullock and makes sure he knows it, before asking April to take him to see Roy Carter. Roy begs Paladin and April for help, but they really have no hope to offer him. Paladin insists that he needs the chaplain's help. "What do you want me to do? Break the law myself?" April asks. That, Paladin says, depends on whose law the chaplain is talking about. But April can only offer a mealy-mouthed excuse that he, too, is bound by the law. Again, Count Paladin unimpressed. All the while, in the prison yard, the gallows are being set up for a morning execution. Act 3. Morning. Roy Carter has walked out to the gallows. April walks slowly beside him, administering last rites. In the crowd gathered to witness the execution are Sidney Carter and his men. Paladin again demands a 3-hour delay from Bullock. Request denied. When Bullock pulls the rope that should end Roy's life, nothing happens. It seems someone has sabotaged the mechanism of the gallows. Paladin quietly asks Roy to get behind him, and then Sid Carter and his men create a distraction. Paladin and Roy race through the door, barring it behind them, but there's nowhere to go except back to the cell block. Paladin shoves Roy back into his cell and then joins him, closing the door and breaking off the key in the lock. The only thing that'll get the two men out of the cell now is a hacksaw, and that'll be slow going because, well, prison cells aren't designed to be that easy to get out of. A second hacksaw blade will be needed, and that means someone has to make a ride into town. When Paladin makes a grab for the hacksaw, a guard introduces him to the butt of a rifle. Furious, Bullock orders the prison guards to shoot him, but the chaplain intervenes. Getting another hacksaw blade will already delay the execution by an hour. Why not go ahead and delay it by 3? Bullock threatens April's job, while Paladin quietly reminds April that he is held to a higher law than the one Bullock is enforcing. Chaplain Robert April grabs the hacksaw and breaks the blade, and a good deal of his own skin, barehanded. Bullock orders the guards to ride back into town and get more blades. When he's told the trip will take at least 2 hours, the warden walks away with his guards behind him. He knows that by the time they can resume getting the condemned men out of the cell, the stay of execution will have been delivered. He's beaten. Paladin is able to simply kick the cell door open and tells Roy he's going to live. He also tells April he needs to get his hands looked at. After Roy Carter's release, April vows to pick up his plan to build a library, and Roy offers to help him. Paladin hands over a sizable wad of cash as a donation to get them started. But Sidney Carter is furious. He paid Paladin to bring his son to him, not let him ride off. Paladin points out that Roy Carter is now a man capable of making his own decisions, and bids the elder Carter a disdainful farewell. The end.
Thank you so much for that recap, Earl. A fine job, as always.
Thank you. I accept your sentence. There's a lot going on with this one. I think it's safe to say this one may be just a bit meatier than Ella West.
Yeah.
And catch me if I'm wrong here, reality check me, for better reasons.
Yes.
So, I like that Paladin's testimony is not for sale. And his sense of justice is not for sale. Okay, cool. That'd still be $5,000. You remember when 10% of Tomahawk Carter's season sounded like a lot of money?
I know, right? He, when he said, that'll be $5,000, I was like, heck, that's still a pretty big ticket today.
Yeah. Well, it's a bigger ticket today than you think.
Yeah.
Because adjusting for... Now, the story takes place in the 1870s. We've narrowed that down. But the show went out on the air in 1958. So to a 1958 audience, adjusted for inflation, that bill is $54,337.
Jeez Louise.
I couldn't even find an inflation calculator that would calculate that $5,000 from 1871 or 1873. So I'm going to assume that actually the number should be much bigger.
Yeah, my goodness.
Yeah, I hope Paladin has payment plans.
Yeah. I mean, Mr. Carter did say he owned half the cattle in the state. I think he can afford it.
I hope so. Even though he wasn't out rustling cattle that night. Here's a question for you. Here's something for us to ponder. Is Paladin taking way too much of a risk here, betting his life that the chaplain is going to make a conspicuous show of moral courage?
That's a good question. I considered that. I think maybe he had an inkling based on what the chaplain said to the warden about part of the reason he does his job is to give the prisoners dignity, to remind them that they're human. And I mean, I know a lot of folks who have worked in the prison system, and they're folks who are chaplains and teachers, and they actually care about the human dignity of the people that are in the prison walls, which is more than I can say for a lot of folks that run the prison.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
And boy, it's amazing how much things have not changed. I found myself wondering what Plan B was,
right,
if April didn't grow a spine in this story.
Yeah. Because
Paladin surrendered all of his weapons to the guards at the gate. Now, granted, Paladin is kind of the 50s version of Indiana Jones. I mean, he's armed even when he's unarmed because he's armed with his wits or what have you. But he's in a jail cell with a condemned man, and he has orchestrated well, maybe it's not a jailbreak because nobody escaped, but he orchestrated something here that threw things off.
Right.
And doing this while Bullock is so kill-happy, that is quite a risk he's running. And I almost wondered if this could be read as Paladin thinking that, if the world is turning its back on mercy, let me off, I'm done.
Yeah, and I think that makes that $5,000 sum he's extracted from Mr. Carter more reasonable. It's like, if I could very well die doing this mission, then you need to make it worth my while. So, again, saving an innocent man's life, pro bono. But because you're doing this and you didn't even care to do this yourself, it's going to cost you $5,000. That's kind of how I read that.
Oh, yeah. Paladin's disdain for Carter Sr. is super clear, and I'm going to get into that more in the serious discussion. Okay, so Robert April's hands are really messed up by grabbing that hacksaw blade, as anybody's would be. Am I reading way too much into this? Or are these injuries April's own metaphorical stigmata? I
literally had the exact same note. I'm really glad that was not lost on you either. But yes, I think so, Earl. I think that's a good symbol to point out. And I would assume folks in 1958 would have caught that. Maybe not. But it definitely occurred to me that those aren't quite nail-pierced hands, but they sure are pierced, aren't they?
As April says, he's willing to shed his blood, but not a man whose guilt cannot be proven. Going back to the kind of fractious relationship between Paladin and Sidney Carter, considering how many of Paladin's jobs end with him delivering a dressing down to the person who hired him and paid him, it's a good thing that Yelp wasn't a thing in the 1870s. I can see it now. Saved my son's life, but then insulted me to my face in a really classy way that I couldn't argue with. 2 stars, do not recommend.
Maybe he would be generous enough to say, delivered as promised, but no tact.
Okay, Ashley, we have to pass sentence on this episode of Have Gun Will Travel, and boy, is there plenty to talk about. I fear that once I get started, there's going to be no shutting me up. So you know what? You jump on this moving train first, and I'm just going to sit back.
I think I'm going to have to give a stay of execution on this episode, Earl. I liked it a whole lot better than Ella West. That, first of all, made it fun. But I really love the discussion that we get about what is justice.
Yes.
In this episode. I mean, for 26 minutes, that's a really big theme.
It's a big ask.
Yeah, it's a big ask. It's a big theme to grapple with. First of all, Carter and his men are flagging down Kino because they knew he did it, but we didn't have the evidence. We didn't have the proof. So they've got him. And they literally have the receipts. So let's just form a lynch mob? No, I love that Paladin pointed out, I don't like a horse thief, but I like lynchings even less. It's like, that is not the typical justice that we see portrayed in these Wild West shows and films. So I really appreciated that. But they take that even further. Not only does this man have the evidence you need to save your son's life, this guy, all he cares about is his image. He has to play the big man. This man is responsible for putting my son in jail, so I hung him myself. Nobody's gonna mess with me. And he doesn't even care that by bringing this man in to let the law handle the crime, which would probably result in his hanging anyway, that his son might live. I can't even fathom that.
Let me ask you a question that occurred to me. Given that Roy and his father part on less than great terms at the end of the show, do you think their relationship was that great to begin with?
Oh, definitely not. Definitely not. But we don't know that to start.
True.
Except for the fact that this guy is so bent on catching Kino that he fails to recognize, instead of just catching him and hanging him myself, I could turn him in, his testimony would free my son. It's like that, either one, he doesn't care, or it doesn't occur to him, like in the heat of passion. I could have maybe seen it as the second one, if not everybody else around him saying, yeah, why aren't we doing that? That doesn't make sense.
It's interesting that once Paladin says these things out loud, Jesse's like, oh yeah, I should have been saying that all along. Well, good for you showing up to the party. Just a little bit late, Jesse.
Right.
But then, Jesse gets smacked in the face by Carter for that.
Yeah.
So it's obvious why none of his own men have said anything. You homed in on exactly the same line that I did. Where Jesse says, why ain't we taking Kino here into the marshal? Why ain't we trying to get in touch with the governor? That'd save Roy. But that wouldn't let you play the big man, now would it? And that's the point at which he gets punched.
Right.
Gene's script is passing its judgment on Sid Carter in the first scene, and it does not let up at any point, because Paladin's farewell to him at the end of the show, it's just, goodbye, Mr. Carter. It's just dripping with, I am done with you.
Mm-hmm. It is the proverbial middle finger without the middle finger.
Yeah, you couldn't get the middle finger on TV in the 50s, so that tone of voice, which Richard Boone does magnificently, will have to do. I've got to divert here, and again, credit, we have an episode directed by Andy McLaughlin. Some of those close-ups on Richard Boone as Paladin are just amazing. You can see the wheels turning in his head. We have not kind of done a mini biography of Boone, and I need to soon, because he is a serious actor. After he was done with Have Gun, he was teaching acting, and before that, he learned from some of the big shots in the business prior to the days of the Hollywood blacklist. Boone understands the assignment completely here. You can see every single cog, every single wheel turning in his head. He puts it on display for you. Now back to the script. Gene doesn't let up when he deals with Bullock, the prison warden, either. Bullock claims that he has no choice, but, as he puts it, he's going to execute a man in a certain way at a certain time. In Bullock's mind, he is just following orders, although, obviously, for obvious reasons, because everyone's related to everybody in this story, it's personal. But just following orders are three words that have papered over far too many atrocities in human history, including as recently as the Nuremberg trials, which were held just over a decade before the premiere of this episode of Have Gun Will Travel. So it seems very clear what, through Paladin, Gene is passing judgment on here.
Definitely. It's kind of the same sense of obeying the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law.
Yeah, and I think that is really at the heart of this. Now, it is interesting to once again, and people always seem surprised by this because Gene Roddenberry was already an atheist at the point at which he embarked on his writing career. But again, kind of obliquely, this story is referencing the Bible.
Yes.
But the script regards Robert April as the biggest coward of all. He is the chaplain. His moral standing is acknowledged. It's not respected, but it is acknowledged. And he is serving in a position where he is expected to be the one advocating for mercy. Obviously, April has been cowed into doing no such thing after far too many run-ins with Bullock. Paladin has to shame April into standing up for the courage of his convictions, and only then does April shine and show some agency. It's fascinating how full of flawed people this story is.
Yeah. I really loved the line that Paladin gives about choosing, instead of choosing the lesser of two evils, choose no evil. Because
Right.
isn't that book in your hand written by the one who chose no evil at all? And I'm like, whoa, that's a mic drop right there, my friend.
Yeah, it's on the nose, and it's kind of interesting because way back in Mr. District Attorney and Highway Patrol, we were actually quoting scripture. We're kind of tiptoeing around that now. And yet, I don't feel like the impact of having it in the conversation is blunted in even the slightest way.
While watching this episode, I kept thinking the King James translation of 2 Timothy 2:15 talks about rightly dividing the word of truth. I wrote down the reference in the NIV. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who does not need to be ashamed, and who correctly handles the word of truth. And I think that is both the charge and the accusation that Paladin is giving Chaplain April here. He's like, hey, you're the chaplain and you're not doing your job. You're not doing everything within your power to get this man the mercy and justice that he deserves because you're afraid of losing your position.
Yeah, and again, that brings me back to, okay, clearly it was plan A in Paladin's head all along. Okay, I'm going to get the chaplain on my side, and we're going to delay this thing. What was plan B? Because I don't think that April's moral cowardice for about the first 2/3 of this story was what Paladin expected to find on the inside.
Yeah. Doing what he could to sabotage the execution, get Carter back into the cell, break the key in the lock. Those are things that all would definitely slow them down. But, a lot of this is left to chance if not for the intervention of Robert April.
Yeah, it's pure desperation, and it's about as bad a situation as I've seen Paladin in one of Gene's scripts. Okay, Ashley, we've reached the end of the trail of evidence in the hanging of Roy Carter. One thing I'm very happy about with this episode is that what is described in the title of the episode does not actually happen. That's a relief.
Yes. There was an attempt. An attempt was made.
Yeah, an attempt was made, but for a wedge-shaped piece of wood. So, does this one hold up for you? What messages did you find in it?
I thought this was an exceedingly relevant show, even for today. So a lot of these shows are ones that are revisited in reruns still on like some broadcast TV channels that my dad watches. My dad loves westerns and told me, I confirmed that he has in fact watched Have Gun Will Travel, watched it when it was on the air when he was growing up, still watches it some today. So quintessential boomer TV. A lot of folks in that generation, I'm not willing to say 100% of everyone does this thing, but a lot of them are like, yeah, well, if that guy's in jail, he deserved it. There's very little chance, it's not the presumed innocent until proven guilty. We've got the proof that the guy is innocent. We're just not letting it enter into play. And so the way that justice is handled in this episode, by Paladin having to somewhat reach outside the law by, more than somewhat, he delayed a man's hanging, which is through sabotaging the gallows. That's one thing. But then also putting him back in jail, ironically, just long enough to where you could say he didn't escape. We're just delaying until we can get the stay of execution from the governor, because we have evidence that proves his innocence. It's an episode that I feel like if it ran today, a lot of folks might say it was woke, quote unquote.
Oh, definitely. And the thing about it is, like I said earlier, it's not a jailbreak.
Right.
They're breaking back into the jail. That's maybe not a good way to be safe, but I believe Paladin is very aware that the optics of an actual escape would be so much worse.
Right.
Because then he and Roy would be on the run from the law, which, at that point, you close everyone's mind to the possibility that perhaps Roy Crowder is innocent.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's talk a little bit about Crowder's dad. He is utterly oblivious to the irony that mere hours after he was dead set on hanging Keno Smith just to bring someone to what he considers justice, the same fate awaits his son at the hands of a warden who could be considered overzealous. This is a very modern problem that Gene is describing in his script. This has not gone away at all. Do people want justice equally applied for everyone? Or do they just want it to be a hammer to come down on the heads of the people they don't like? In which case, that's not justice, that's retribution.
Yes.
And that only begets more retribution, and the next thing you know, everyone's barreling down a road to hell because now we're just exchanging blows back and forth. The hard step to take in this story is mercy. And Paladin has to force everyone's hand in this script. He has to stop Sidney Crowder and his gang from hanging Keno Smith. Then he has to stop Bullock from hanging Roy Crowder. Roy's father is so blinded to the idea of showing mercy, he's already given up on saving his own son. Or, as we pointed out earlier, we speculated maybe he doesn't care that much in the first place, which, bad dad. You're not getting the #1 dad mug this year.
Nope.
He's already trying to skip to the retribution step of the process. And it is equally clear that Bullock sees himself as an instrument of retribution. And Bullock falls back on quoting Exodus, an eye for an eye. And as you pointed out, a lot of people, and not even necessarily a lot of people of a certain age, just a lot of people still do that now. To be fair, eye for an eye is lex talionis, which predates the written Hebrew Bible by a pretty good chunk of time. But for all the people wanting to throw the book of Exodus at this problem, you do not hear so many people quoting from the book of James. Judgment will be merciless to one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Paladin has to force everyone to allow mercy to triumph over judgment. Paladin has to stand up to people who are happy to quote Scripture. They're a lot less enthusiastic about living by it.
Yes.
Paladin has to be a mirror, effectively, and show everyone their hypocrisy in this story, and make them decide, okay, are you going to die on that hill, or are you going to course correct? And in so doing, the story invites the audience to consider what they would do in the same situation. And that is where this episode is absolutely timeless. Because we should all still be asking ourselves whether we err on the side of humanity, on the side of mercy. And depending on what our answer is, should we be trying to improve that answer? I believe it was Kurt Vonnegut Jr. who once said that every courthouse wants the 10 Commandments posted at the doors. But curiously enough, nobody seems to want the Beatitudes or the Sermon on the Mount hanging there next to them.
Yes.
We need to avoid rushing to judgment, and we really need to avoid rushing straight to punishment. All this from 26 minutes of TV. That's great, timeless storytelling. I love this episode. This is fantastic. So, yeah, consider this my apology for bringing you in first to talk Ella West.
No.
This is a much better episode.
No, this was great. This was great. And as you were thinking, I'd not heard that Kurt Vonnegut quote. And I was like, I'd rather have the Beatitudes. And there you go. There you go. That's great. I also have to consider, if we're looking at Gene's previous work and how maybe we see what would eventually make its way into Star Trek, I feel like this episode almost asks the question, is execution just? because once we get to original series, we don't kill people for crimes anymore. And also, crime doesn't really exist that much because we're in a post-scarcity future. But when we do have people who break the law, they're never executed. There's always, we've grown past that. We don't kill people for crimes anymore.
Well, the Federation doesn't. Well, unless you go to Talos 4.
That's true.
But, I find it fascinating that a member of the cast of this episode turned up later in Devil in the Dark in the first season of TOS. Where we get 3 very important words in that episode too. No kill I. It's almost the same story if you think about it. It's just, it's going to be the hanging of Blob Crutter in that episode, and not Roy Crutter. But it's almost the same construction. Kirk has to go in there and prove the creature's innocence. And, Spock's coming in at the 11th hour with the evidence via mind meld. And in the meantime, Kirk is literally having to hold off all the miners at phaser point to prevent them from basically becoming a space lynch mob.
Right.
And so this really feels like one of the first places where you can draw a straight line from here to not just the original series, but a specific episode of the original series. Mm-hmm. And so if the remit of this podcast is to see if Gene was slipping messages into the entertainment he was writing before he conceived of the Starship Enterprise, yes, the answer is yes.
Yep.
I guess we could stop now, but no, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep going.
Yeah. I think also, last episode when you and I were talking about, Paladin's name is Paladin. I play Dungeons and Dragons. Paladins are knights on a holy quest. This, I feel, is more in line with the meaning of that name here, because he is, truly doing something that I believe is holy, is showing mercy and acting with justice. So I really, really loved this episode. It was a great palate cleanser after the frustration of LOS.
I really feel like this is, and I may revise this later. I feel like this is not only a top 5 Gene script for Have Gun Will Travel, this may well be a top 5 episode of Have Gun Will Travel, full stop. Because this, to me, this is who Paladin should be to earn that name.
Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Gene-ology, The Road to Wickenburg. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takachi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.